All right, welcome to Lesson D, which is increasing, decreasing, and constant functions. Before I move on, I want to do a little service announcement here. So take a look at this number line with the letter X on it to represent the horizontal axis. Right here in the middle is my origin. All my numbers to the right of the origin, we all know that that's the positive end. And all numbers to the left of the origin, we all know that's on the negative end. So here's my question. What is greater? Is 7 greater? Or is negative 8 greater? Well, it might come as a surprise to you that number 7 is actually greater. So we would write 7 and negative 8 like this. I'm writing that negative 8 is less than 7. Or if I wanted to write it backwards, I could write 7 is greater than negative 8. Okay, and the reason why is that the rule for these inequalities is that anything on the right side is greater. It's greater. And anything on the left side is lesser. And that's kind of funny. Left and lesser both start with the same letter. Okay, and with a vertical axis, which is our y-axis, or sometimes our function of x-axis, right? Anything higher, so more up, is greater. And anything down is lesser. So here, in negative 2 and 5, right, I can say that negative 2 is smaller than 5, or alternatively, I could write 5 is greater than negative 2. Both of these statements say the same thing. Now, a lot of you guys have a hard time interpreting this symbol and what it means. So imagine the symbol is an alligator, and the alligator is going to eat something. It's always going to eat the greater number, and it's going to ignore the lesser number, right? And that's how we memorize this symbol. All right, that was a review of 5th grade. Now let's go to our AP Pre-Cal. So we're going to learn the difference between an increasing function, a decreasing function, and a constant function. And we're going to do it in plain English first. So what is an increasing function? An increasing function says that as I move to the right, meaning as I go from A to B on the x-axis, my y values get higher. Okay? So in plain English, an increasing function happens when the x values increase and the y values also increase, right? So when x increases, the y increases as well. A decreasing function happens that when you increase the x value, meaning you're still going from left to right, my y value drops from a higher number to a lower number. So that's what a decreasing function is. And of course, a constant function is that when I increase my x value from A to B, my y value never changes. It just stays the same. So that right there, those 3 statements right there explain what an increasing function is, a decreasing function is, and a constant function. Now let's go over what this means in fancy language. And I'm going to explain the fancy language and why it is. So take a look here. Y'all would agree with me that B is on the right and A is on the left. That by definition means that B is greater than A. And in fact, in all of these scenarios, B was greater than A, right? So that's why all 3 of these fancy statements start with if A is less than B, if A is less than B, if A is less than B. That's a fancy way of saying that B is to the right of A. Okay. Now, look here. Obviously, f of B is higher than f of A. So for this scenario, I can write that f of B is greater than f of A, or, I'm going to draw a line there so I don't get confused, or f of A is smaller than f of B, right? So either of these are true. So that's what it's saying here. If my B is to the right of A, and my y value for B is higher than my A value, then that's called increasing, right? In a decreasing function, it flips. B is still greater than A, but now f of B is smaller than f of A, or I would write that f of A is greater than f of B, right? So that would cause a decrease. And over here, this one's the easy one. F of A equals F of B. So that explains the fancy language in these three spots right here. All right, let's analyze this graph. And we're going to determine the changes in these functions, right? So we have a graph here that's like curvy here, and then it becomes flat right there. All right, question 1 is, explain why the interval is decreasing from -2 to -1. So when interpreting increasing function, decreasing function, and constant function, read it like a book. Read it left to right. Read it so that A is smaller than B. Okay? So we're going to compare this point and this point, right? Now, from here to here, right, my x value increased from -2 to -1. There's still an increase on the x. But the function dropped from 3 to -5. So how would I explain that in complete sentences? I would say, as the x value goes from -2 to 1, the y value dropped from 3 to -5. And then I would say, therefore, triple dots means therefore in math, it is decreasing. Okay. But now coming back to my graph, here, as I go from -1 to 1, my graph is now rising. It's going higher and higher, right? And that's showing me what increasing is, right? So as the x value goes from -1 to 1, the y value rises from -5 to 3. Therefore, it is increasing. And finally, at the last spot, at interval 1 or greater, my y value is not changing at all. So as the x value increases from 2, the y value stays the same. Therefore, it is constant. Okay, one last thing I want to talk about here is be very careful. Sometimes you will see an arrow here pointing up. That does not mean that my function is increasing. When we are interpreting increase, decrease, and constants, we are always reading our graphs from left to right. This arrow means that this curve keeps going that way. But that doesn't mean it's increasing. That's still a decreasing curve. And in the same way here, this arrow pointing to the right, that just means that this line keeps going on and on and on forever and ever. So over here in my increasing function, there might be an arrow pointing this way and an arrow pointing that way. Never look at the arrows to determine increase. Look at the values. Are the values rising as I read from left to right, or are they dropping? If my values rise, that's an increase. If my values are dropping, that's a decrease. And if my values are always the same, that is called a constant function.